Welcome to Science Fiction 101, the podcast series where we explore the science fiction field from all angles, covering the past, the present, and the future. We're your hosts. I'm Phil.
And I'm Colin.
And it's 2022. Good grief, we're living in the future, Colin. How's the future been for you so far?
Cold. Very cold.
Oh no, is that how it's going to be forever?
I hope not. I hope that someday perhaps maybe the sun will reignite and the clouds will leave Oregon.
As long as they don't head across this way to the UK and block out the sun over here. I'm not ready for a nuclear winter, not just yet.
Okie doke.
So, yeah, for the benefit of listeners, I might point out it's the 4th of February 2022 as we record this. Our last episode was a sort of a Christmas special. We went back 70 years and reviewed Galaxy magazine from December 1951. And this time we're going to go, well, I was going to say very much to the present, but it is back in time a little bit. We're going for December 2021 and the issue of Clarkesworld that came out in that month. So we've leapt forward 70 years from our previous episode. And we're going to try and compare the two. Also today, we'll have some kind of quiz, which I don't know much about, but Colin's prepared a quiz, apparently, and therefore he's going to be testing me. Is it going to be fun, Colin?
I think this quiz is right up your alley this time.
Oh, good. Very good. We had some comments on our previous episode, so I'll just go through those before we launch into our new stuff for today. First of all, Emmanuel, who's one of our regulars, tweeted to say, good and original episode. That was the one about Galaxy magazine, and he thanked us for that. And then he gave us a suggestion for a future episode, so this is something we should have a think about. He's suggested that at some point we have a discussion about great science fiction series, and he's given us some examples. The Foundation series, one I cannot pronounce, and I always struggle when this one comes up. Maybe you can help me with this, Colin. Vorkosigan, I don't know how you pronounce it. So,
Vorkosigan.
Thank you. Every time I see that word, I'm going to get you to say it. The Murderbot series, Oxford Time Travel, etc. He says, but he named 4 there. So I think we could indeed tackle at least one of those series in the future. Foundation I read years ago and tried to reread it at some point, but found it a bit dull on a reread. I've never read any of the series beginning with V, which is pronounced
Vorkosigan.
Thank you. Haven't read any of those. I think I read a sample chapter of a Martha Wells Murderbot, and I'm sure that I read at least one chapter of the Connie Willis Oxford Time Travel series. What's been your experience with those? Do you know any of those, Colin?
I know all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, little bits of all of them, except for the Connie Willis series.
Okay.
I read the first book in the Vorkosigan series.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's because Tor gave it out as a free download a while ago.
Okay. Yeah.
I've read all the Murderbot stories and really enjoy them. I've read all 8 books in the Foundation series and the extended series that come after it.
Right. Yeah.
And before it.
Okay. I think that's one of the things that put me off rereading Foundation. When I first read it, it was the trilogy. That's all there was. But then subsequently there came out these expansions and extensions, and so it's one of those where I began to feel the universe of Foundation was now too big for me to comfortably go back into it. But yeah, I think we could tackle one of those at some point. The difficulty, of course, would be doing the research, because it sounds like one of us would have to read, well, an entire series, because we're not in sync, are we? I mean, I've read bits that you haven't read, possibly, but it's more likely you've read bits that I haven't read. So anyway, we'll have a think about that, Emmanuel. Thanks for your suggestion there. Also, when our last episode went out, I posted a link to it in one of the Facebook groups that I belong to, which is called Best Science Fiction and Fantasy Short Fiction. And that's a group where they very specifically have group reads. Now, I always feel I'm an imposter in that group because I don't usually participate in the group reads. But what happens is that members of the group suggest particular stories or particular anthologies for the members to read, and then they comment on the stories. And I'm usually just a bystander because I don't usually take part in the group read. But the group members were very gracious in their comments on the podcast episode. So John, I'm just giving first names here, John said that he had definitely previously read the Leiber and Kornbluth stories that we discussed when we reviewed Galaxy. He said he was a big Fritz Leiber fan, but he wouldn't say A Pail of Air was one of Leiber's very best. Now, that's interesting to know. I've read just a small amount of Leiber. I've probably read the award-winning stories, and that's about it. So I don't really have a grasp on the full breadth of Fritz Leiber's work. So that's useful to know. From the same group, Paul said that the Leiber story was a charming one that shows his lighter side. And that's interesting to know. I didn't consider the story to be particularly light.
The Leiber story is the one that's A Pail of Air, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Boy, given that it was written from the perspective of a 10-year-old boy, I think it was, fairly light in tone,
yes.
Even though they're talking about, the potential loss of the human race because of an astronomical event.
Yeah. Somebody else in that same Facebook group, Jim, said that he was born in 1951, and he said if he could have crawled out of the maternity ward under his own power and made it to a newsstand, that issue of Galaxy, the one that we reviewed, would have been on the rack at that point. And then he said he thoroughly enjoyed the podcast all the way to the end and looks forward to us covering a December 2021 magazine. And that's what we're going to do today. So hopefully Jim will be listening to this as well. And he did actually follow along with the podcast, he says, because he had a copy of it on his iPad and sort of followed what we were talking about as we were talking. So that's very good. But he also owns a physical copy of that issue.
Wow.
So thanks for everyone who sent in comments on that.
Okay. This quiz is 1950s sci-fi movies.
Oh.
Are you ready, Phil?
I'm as ready as I ever will be, yes.
First question. Which movie does this tagline belong to? A Titanic beauty spreads a macabre wave of horror. Is that Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, The Amazing Colossal Man, or Teenagers from Outer Space?
There's got to be Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, surely.
It is.
Good.
From 1958.
I don't think I've ever seen it. I've only ever seen the poster and various memes based on the poster.
You had talked about wanting to finish all of the science fiction movies of the 50s, so I thought that one surprised me that you hadn't watched because it tends to be a little more well-known than some of the other movies from that time.
I must have seen bad reviews of it, and I've stayed away.
All right, next question. The idea of a doomsday machine was reused in a 1966 Star Trek episode. What movie inspired it? GOG, Spaceways, or Kronos?
I thought you were going to have Moby Dick in there, because that's the thing that inspired it. You did say the Doomsday Machine, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah. Give me those films again.
GOG,
Yeah.
Spaceways,
Yeah.
Kronos.
Now, I've seen Spaceways, and I don't remember there being any kind of colossal machine that destroys stuff. So I'm going to dismiss Spaceways. So then it's going to be a 50-50 between the other two. So I'm going to say GOG.
It's Kronos.
Oh.
There's an energy-absorbing robot in the 1957 Kronos movie.
Oh, okay.
Although, given that a man who is well-versed in the genre and, teaches film and says, I expected it to be Moby Dick, it's possible this isn't the best written question. So let's move past it and go to another one.
Okay.
Which was the first sci-fi space adventure to be made after World War II? The Thing, Destination Moon, or Rocket Ship XM?
Well, in my head, Destination Moon is 1950 and The Thing is 1951. Now the question then is whether Rocket Ship XM is before 1950. I don't think it is, so I'm going to say Destination Moon.
It was Rocket Ship XM. It was shot in 18 days and had a $94,000 budget, released in 1950.
Oh, so it was the same year as Destination Moon.
Destination Moon came out in June. Rocket Ship XM came out in May.
Oh, so it's a month ahead of it. Okay.
I have a hard time remembering release dates at all, even by year, and their directors. So the fact that you can remember them by year, I'm impressed.
I couldn't remember Rocket Ship XM.
Okay, next question. Released within just one day of each other, which two movies shared sets and wardrobe? Project Moonbase and Cat Women of the Moon, or The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms and Cat Women of the Moon, or Invaders from Mars and Cat Women of the Moon?
Well, it's definitely not B, because those two films are totally different. I don't think it's C, because Invaders from Mars really has a beautiful art direction, whereas Catwomen from the Moon, or whatever it's called, is very cheap looking. So I think the answer's got to be the first pair that you gave me.
Project Moonbase and Cat Women of the Moon?
Yeah.
That is correct. Both released in 1953.
Wow.
Okay. Known for shooting on shoestring budgets, director Edgar G. Ulmer filmed which of his movies in 6 days, with sets left over from 1948's Joan of Arc? The Black Cat, The Man from Planet X, or The Strange Woman?
Well, when you said the name, The Man from Planet X is the only title that sprang to mind. It's the only film of his that I can recall. But I don't think that is filmed on sets from Joan of Arc. Is that what you said?
Uh-huh.
I can't believe that's the case. So it's one of the other two, so I'll say it's C.
The Strange Woman.
Yeah.
It was The Man from Planet X.
How can that be?
Apparently, Planet X looks a lot like medieval France. I don't know.
I watched that film last year. It was this thing of feeling that I needed to be a completist, and I realised I'd never seen it, so I made a point of watching it. I don't remember it looking like Joan of Arc. That means I've got to watch it again. Oh no.
and pay particular attention to the sets.
Yeah. And then I've got to watch Joan of Arc because I don't know what that looked like.
Okay. In what category did 1953's The War of the Worlds win an Academy Award? The options are Best Costume Design, Best Film Editing, or Best Visual Effects.
Visual effects, definitely.
That is correct.
This is the curse of science fiction films. If you make a science fiction film, you're never going to get a Best Picture Oscar, you're never going to get a Best Director, you're rarely going to get Best Screenplay, but you are allowed Best Visual Effects. That's about all.
Yeah. Sometimes costume design, sometimes makeup.
Yeah.
Which was Warner Brothers' highest grossing movie in 1954? Plan 9 from Outer Space, Red Planet Mars, or Them, with an exclamation point?
Certainly not the first one, because that didn't make any money at all. I'm going to say Them, because that was a very influential film.
Them is correct.
Giant ants, wasn't it?
Yes, I was going to say that, yeah. Although Plan 9 from Outer Space is a cult favorite these days.
But not then.
No, no, definitely not then. Which film is a loose retelling of Shakespeare's The Tempest? The War of the Worlds, Forbidden Planet,
Yep.
The Day the Earth Stood Still. That is correct. And I did not know that.
Oh.
Which British sci-fi comedy starring Alec Guinness centered around a chemist who invents an everlasting fabric? The Man from Planet X, The Man in the White Suit, The Cosmic Man?
The Man in the White Suit.
That is correct.
Yeah. And it's a very good film.
Is it adapted?
I don't think it is. I think it was an original piece.
The Man in the White Suit. I'll have to remember that one. Okay, before giving us Buck Rogers and The Bionic Woman on the small screen, which director gave us nearly a dozen American sci-fi horror films? Billy Wilder, Jack Arnold, or Robert Aldrich?
It has to be Jack Arnold, because he's the only one of those three people who worked in television after making movies.
That is correct. One of the most prolific sci-fi horror film directors in the 1950s. All right. In which Jack Arnold directed movie is Clint Eastwood credited with his first speaking role? Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Incredible Shrinking Man, Revenge of the Creature.
I don't know this one. I'm going to guess it's Revenge of the Creature.
That is correct.
Wow. Lucky guess.
The alien in which classic from 1951, set in 1982, is referred to as an intellectual carrot? The Brain Eaters, The Thing from Another World, When Worlds Collide.
It's The Thing.
Yeah, I still don't get that adaptation, how they pulled that from Campbell's work. In which 1950s sci-fi Cold War story does a former Nazi scientist, now working for the Soviets, beam signals that God is on Mars? 2000, 03, 31, 2300 hours, Radar Men from the Moon, Red Planet Mars.
I'm not sure. I'm going to guess it's the one in the middle.
Radar Men from the Moon?
Yeah.
It's Red Planet Mars.
Oh, really?
Directed by Harry Horner.
You know, that's another one I don't think I've seen.
Yeah, I haven't either, so don't feel bad.
Oh, good.
Which H.G. Wells classic story was remade by Steven Spielberg in 2005?
War of the Worlds.
The War of the Worlds. What awakens the 200-foot creature in Ishiro Honda's Americanized Godzilla? Atomic bomb testing, fishermen, or Rodan and Gamera?
Well, I assume it's Atomic Bomb, but I don't know if I've seen the... This is the Americanized version, did you say?
Yes.
I don't know that I've ever seen that. I've only seen the original Japanese cut. But it's got to be Atomic Bomb, surely.
It is. It's atomic bomb testing.
Phew.
Well, when things get Americanized, you just never know.
They put Raymond Burr in it.
Yeah, they did.
In a very weird way. Just by shooting some new footage and splicing it in and hoping no one would notice.
Now, you see, when I was growing up as a young boy, every day at noon on one of the local television stations, they played Perry Mason. And, you would come in from playing outside or doing whatever and watch Perry Mason and then go right back outside.
It's funny because for many years, I had never seen Perry Mason, but I knew him as Ironside.
Oh, yeah. Well, you acquitted yourself very well. You got 11 out of 15 correct.
Wow. Shockingly, there were so many there where I have to say I've never seen it.
Yeah, I hadn't seen hardly any of those. I recognize several by name, and so I know some plot points and stuff, but when it comes to directors and exact dates, I would be completely lost.
I tend to be quite good with years, and I sort of know the famous ones, but it's these obscure ones that... Well, it's basically the ones that didn't get shown on British TV when I was growing up. They're the ones that have slipped through the net. I don't think Rocket Ship XM ever turned up on British TV, whereas something like The Day the Earth Stood Still, that seemed to be on every week. The Thing seemed to be on a couple of times a year. The Incredible Shrinking Man was a bit rarer. You maybe got that about every 3 or 4 years. I swear that Rocket Ship XM, Red Planet Mars, or whatever it's called, I swear we never got those on TV. And that was the only place that you would get them.
No tapes, no media, no internet.
No, nothing. Well, thank you for the marvellous quiz. To be honest, I'm probably better at 1950s films than later eras. I might be good in the 1960s, but only because there weren't very many science fiction films in the 1960s. I will have to come up with a fiendish quiz to turn back on you in a future episode.
I look forward to it.
Now, Clarkesworld. What's your experience with Clarkesworld? Have you read it previously?
The science fiction world is really different in 2021 than 1951.
Yeah.
Science fiction is so easy to find now versus having to be subscribed to a magazine. Everything is online. And I know that I've read some stories out of Clarkesworld, but I'm not a regular reader and I'm not a subscriber.
Yeah, and that's very similar to me. I've tended to dip into it. What I'd like to do, as we discuss the December 2021 issue of Clarkesworld, is draw some comparisons between what we see in this magazine and what we saw in the 70-year-old issue of Galaxy. Obviously, it is a very unfair comparison in many ways. And as Colin just said, we're talking about purely online magazines now, so a very different experience. But if, as a listener, you're able to dip into Clarkesworld as we're talking, you might find it illuminating. I think my first observation is to be about the format and the availability of the magazine, which is really the point Colin just made. But it's free. That's one of the major differences. It's absolutely free. You can get all of Clarkesworld for nothing. All the stories are online. You can get them as a Kindle edition. I think you have to pay for that. In fact, you do. I took out a subscription in order to access the Kindle version. Plus, they read all the stories as little audiobooks, as a podcast series. So you can get all of that for free as well. And it's quite remarkable that you can do that, and without much intrusive advertising. That, I think, is really a remarkable achievement. I don't know how they do it. I'd love to see their spreadsheet of how they make money. No, I wouldn't really, but it's a curious thing, isn't it, that something can be totally free.
There's no printing cost. And printing today is less expensive than it used to be because there's no presses involved. You just literally send it to a printer. Although maybe with a magazine publishing is slightly more formal than that. I would guess that their funding model is a combination of subscriptions and Patreons.
If anyone listening to this is involved with Clarkesworld and you know the secret of their sort of financial model, do let us know. We are slightly curious, I think. Just out of curiosity, Colin, how did you read these stories? Did you read them on a screen, on an e-reader, audiobooks? How did you access them?
I bought an EPUB from Clarkesworld and downloaded it to my laptop and read it on there.
Right, so on a laptop, not on your Nook or Kindle or whatever.
No, not on a pad or a tablet or a phone.
No, okay. I did a bit of a mixture of things. I did read some on my laptop, but as I say, I took out a subscription, so I had the Kindle edition. I did also listen to the audio read of, I think, about 4 of the stories, and for some of those I was listening while I read. I've said before on the podcast that that's something that I quite enjoy doing. I quite enjoy listening to an audiobook while reading. And I think I've also said that usually I have to speed up the audiobook because the audiobooks are usually read a bit slower than I like to read personally. So I always feel a bit guilty for doing that, but it kind of keeps things in sync. The first story I've got on the list to talk about is called The Cold Calculations by Amy Ogden, which for me I think was the star story of this issue. And of course it references another famous science fiction story, which is The Cold Equations by Tom Godwin, a 1952 short story. What did you make of that one?
I read it and I thought it was an interesting response to The Cold Equations because there have been so many of those over the years.
Yeah.
I think that's probably one of the most gratifying things for an author is to know that your story entertains and gets people to become engaged. People were so offended by the story that they wrote rebuttals to it and have written rebuttals to it for 70 years. And this story falls in that category, although what it rebuts is a completely, for me, new take on objections to the story of The Cold Equations.
Do you want to talk about what those particular objections are then, or what that particular take is?
Yeah, so the classic ones have to do with there must have been a way to change the outcome of the story. Yeah. That some detail was missed. And as you learn the history of the story, you learn that that Mr. Godwin did try to have a different outcome, but the editor of the original magazine where it was published was forcing him down this lane. And, collectively they created this story, which has lasted 70 years and stayed in everyone's, at least, foremind. Miss Ogden takes the approach that the entire situation is exploitative.
Yeah.
And that people should not casually write exploitative stories, and brings in several other examples of exploitation throughout America's history, at least as an example, between factory workers and railroad workers and slaves, people that have been underrepresented, exploited for decades, and still are today in some ways. And this idea that someone through writing would almost, this is probably a stretch, endorse the exploitation by writing stories about it versus saying, oh no, this should never happen. You should always save the people in peril. So she actually rewrites the end of the story, the cold equations, at the end of her story.
Yeah. And I think I really like that. I really like the fact that the story takes a stand on what it is to be an author. And so although it is a commentary on the cold equations, it's actually about a bigger issue than that. It's about what it is to be an author, because an author is like a god. An author is creating a whole world and a set of characters. And this is kind of saying to authors of a certain type, it's kind of saying, how dare you? How dare you take this this godlike position and then choose to do such awful things with your characters? Now, on one level, I admire that. On another part of me says, well, they're only fictional characters. You can do what you like. But it's very interesting that I found I could take her position and the opposite position, and I was sort of debating with myself as I was reading the story. And I think that makes it a fantastic story, the fact that it gets you talking and gets you thinking about what these issues are. I thought that was really good. When
the story came out, it apparently was quite sensational. Did you read the commentary about it on File 770?
I might have seen it in passing, but tell me about it.
So being the cold equations and being such a well-known story, that when this rebuttal to it came out, people have been talking about it, and it came to File 770. For me, the interesting thing was they linked to Miss Ogden's Twitter feed. Mm-hmm. And I read her commentary about this because she was getting all kinds of flack and pushback for doing these things. And she has this to say about it. I continue to not be sorry for having written a story that rejects the narrative of the disposability of human lives at the cost of profit and progress, that turns its back on John Campbell's editorial legacy, and that demands solidarity is the only way we can save each other.
Yeah, it's a very, very clear position that she's taking there. And I think it's worth pointing out, for the benefit of anybody who doesn't know the backstory, John W. Campbell was the editor of Astounding Science Fiction magazine, so he's often credited or blamed, depending on your point of view, for the shaping of American science fiction from the 1940s really through to the 1970s. That kind of whole hard science fiction, really scientific, nuts and bolts kind of science fiction. But in recent years, there's kind of been a backlash against Campbell because it's become very clear that, well, he was a racist. He was probably every other kind of ist you can think of. And for a while, his name was attached to things like an award. And now his name's been stripped from that award. And I think is it now called the Astounding Prize or something instead of the John W. Campbell Award?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So there's been a backlash against Campbell. And it's quite clear that Amy Ogden's story, although it's taking issue with the authorship of the story, it's not really taking issue with the credited author of the story, Tom Godwin. It is really about what Campbell forced upon that story, because Godwin wrote him a version of the story where the poor girl survives. But that wasn't good enough for Campbell, who sent it back and said, do it again. And he kept sending it back until he got the ending that he wanted.
I did the same kind of arguing back and forth about, well, whether this whole premise is valid or not. So it must be okay to write stories where people suffer the consequences of their actions.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm looking at this, way too broadly. And so, if people want to correct me on that, I am all ears, please. Because there are consequences for the actions that we take.
Yeah.
At the same time, if you're only exploiting the sentiment of the reader by bringing in this poor innocent young woman who only wants something very innocent and is then thrust into a situation beyond anybody's control, then yeah, I mean, maybe you have an axe to grind, or a complaint, or a valid complaint to make.
Over the years, I've seen quite a few people passing comment on the Tom Godwin story, and I can see what Campbell was trying to do. I mean, quite apart from what he actually did in getting that story rewritten, but in terms of trying to set up a story where there are some situations where physical laws would conspire against you and mean that there would be no possible satisfactory outcome. And in real life, we have these. So the closest I can think of is Apollo 13. There was an explosion on the spaceship, and if the NASA people didn't take action and work out some incredibly complicated things that they could do, if they just left things as they were, those astronauts would not have survived because the laws of physics were against it. However, they did survive, and that's not because you can always find a solution. It's because in this particular instance, they were, through ingenuity, able to find a solution. I still believe there will be many situations for which there is no satisfactory solution and in which people will inevitably die because there are inevitable physical laws. But the question is, does the cold equations prove that? And I think the answer is no. I think the cold equations isn't a great example of that, because as you're reading the story, you do start thinking of, well, why don't they try this? Why don't they try that? And the situation isn't set up in such a cast iron way that it is completely defensible as a story, and therefore people will always pick at it, trying to find a better solution than the one that the author and the editor came up with. However, I don't think that's what Amy Ogden's story is about. I don't think Amy Ogden is saying there's a better way of resolving that story. It's more the moral position that as an author or an editor you have an obligation to be more honest about characters and why you're deploying characters. So I thought that was that was very effective. I really liked it.
And it brings up a huge difference in the state of science fiction and the state of our world between 1951 and 2021. Within a few hours of reading this story, I had immediate feedback from the author about it and what other people thought about it. And I heard directly from the author. I didn't read an editorial. I didn't talk to my neighbors about it. Authors are incredibly approachable and much more public today than they were back in 1950s.
Yeah, I guess if there had been any kind of controversy about a story back in those days, the most immediate thing that anyone could do would be to write a letter, and then that might be published in the next issue, or more likely it would skip an issue because the letter wouldn't arrive in time to appear in the next issue. So you'd have a really drawn out correspondence, and then the author would have to respond to that. I think another difference is the awareness of authors. So the fact that an author can be aware of what it is they are doing. And I don't think, or my impression is that with the cold equations, I don't think the author or the editor were aware of what they were doing. They felt the need to tell a story in a certain way because that was the nature of the magazine that they were putting together. But I don't think they were aware of consequences of decisions and so on. I think modern authors are much more self-conscious and conscious of the genre, the field, and all of that. Mm-hmm. I've got one other comment on the story, and that is that it weaves into the various threads of story. There is a bit in there about what true heroism is, or at least that's my interpretation of it anyway, because it weaves in the story of the cosmonaut Komarov, who died on Soyuz 1 in 1967, the first human to die in a space flight. Mm-hmm. And allegedly, Komarov only went on the mission to protect Yuri Gagarin, because everyone knew that the Soyuz 1 spacecraft was not safe, and if Komarov had backed out because it was not safe, Gagarin, who was the backup, would have been put in his place. And Gagarin, of course, was already a big space hero at this point. So in order to protect Gagarin, Komarov chose to remain on the flight. And Amy Ogden weaves that into the story. In fact, that may not be strictly true. That version of the story of Komarov comes from one book called Starman by Jamie Doran and Piers Bizany? Don't know how you pronounce the name. And it all comes from the testimony of one eyewitness who may not be a reliable witness. Amy Ogden's building in a bit of true story, which unfortunately may not be true. And I think that's unfortunate because she's trying to make a moral point. And if she's building the moral point on something which turns out not to be true, then it weakens the point, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I guess is the only thing that was built in facts versus, the other fictional stories she brought about exploitation. It probably sticks out all the more, but...
Yeah. Maybe this is getting ahead of ourselves, but did that story strike you as being the best one of the batch of the magazine?
It's not my favorite, but it's certainly one of the better stories on the magazine. It's beautifully written. Can I read a quick quote from the story?
Please do, yeah.
Somewhere, sometime, a man sits behind his desk, killing a girl with the stroke of his pen. Not because he hates her. He feels nothing for her at all. To him, she is a simple tool, an externality, an inconvenient hunk of mass. It's never his fault that she dies, of course, even as he damns her over and over again. He's just doing his job. We must, the men at desks insist, chalk her death up to the cold, uncaring universe in which we live.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoy her writing a lot.
The next one in my sort of semi-random list here, I've got to pronounce a funny word now. Oh dear. Vegvizier. Don't know how you pronounce this one. By David Goodman. Do you know how to pronounce that one?
I don't. I almost started looking up the Norse words, and I did look up some other things that were in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, don't.
I mean, it's sort of assuming that it's something like German. Vegvizier would be my best guess. So this one's by David Goodman. My summary of this would be that it's set on the planet Mars, which appears to be under the process of being terraformed, but at the moment still requires people to wear spacesuits and all of that. Mm-hmm. And an astronaut becomes stuck when the drivetrain of his vehicle breaks, and then he heads out in a dust storm looking for a blockhouse, which he knows is out there somewhere, and there he thinks he's going to find shelter and oxygen and a means of communication with potential rescuers. My other note here is he finds himself inside, safe, but doesn't know how he got in. Now, I have to admit, I've totally blanked on that part of the story, but I wrote it down as a note, so I'm assuming that I've accurately described what happens in the story there.
You have, yes.
Good. And then I've written down, he comes to believe that he has been assisted by something from Nordic myth. And then on my notes, I've pasted in a URL to a thing that talks about the Vegvizier symbol and meaning and all of that. And it's basically a compass, a runic compass is this thing that he thinks has assisted him. What was your impression of that one?
This was my favorite story from the magazine. And I think it's because it has that great combination of hard science fiction with some faith elements brought into it. And he does get rescued at the end. It's not a downer story at all.
Spoiler. It had some echoes of The Martian, especially that dust storm and that whole thing of being maybe not totally alone on Mars, but for the purposes of the story, he is pretty much alone. That struck me as being very similar to The Martian as well. But as you say, this kind of mythological, religious element in there is different to anything that I remember from The Martian, and that made it stand out a bit. I thought it was quite engaging in the details, but essentially it seemed to me that the story is basically one of those there was a ghost and it helped me kind of stories. Do you know what I mean? I can't remember any specific story that does that, but I know I've read stories before, usually ghost stories, where there is some sort of mythical being that comes out of the woods and rescues somebody for whom all hope is lost. So it seemed a bit familiar. Now, whether that's an echo of something from mythology, or whether it just felt like a rehashing of an old idea, I'm not quite sure. But I quite enjoyed it in the moment.
Yeah. It reminded me of Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson in ways. Yeah. And that whole idea about being rescued by a ghost, for me, evokes A Christmas Carol. Although that kind of saving and salvation is more moral than physical.
Yeah. Apparently that was the first published story from that author. So I think that's a very good piece of work for a debut. I mean, probably he's been writing for years, because quite often when people have their first published work, they've been slaving away at it for a long time before they've come up with something that becomes publishable. For a first published story, I thought that was quite good.
Yeah.
In passing, I don't really want to dwell on the non-fiction stuff in Clarkesworld, but Clarkesworld does have non-fiction in there, and that does compare a little bit to the Galaxy magazine that we read from 70 years ago, because that Galaxy would often have science articles by Villy Lai, and they would have book reviews and sometimes other articles and editorials as well. So there was always a little smattering of non-fiction in there. And Clarkesworld has science articles, and in this particular issue that we were looking at, there was one on exoplanets. Plus they had interviews with authors, although the authors being interviewed were not authors who were in that issue of the magazine. And I'd like to have seen an interview with one of these authors, please. Maybe that they turn up in some other issue. I don't know.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I was particularly taken by the interview with the Southern Asian author, and being reminded again that there is this huge diversity in the field now, with people coming up with stories that are completely different and inventive and creative. And I'm excited to read them. And we actually have an Asian author in this book.
We do.
Or in this episode.
Yeah. Issue.
We
don't know what to call it, really. It's
this one.
Yeah. And there was also an editorial in there from the editor and owner of Clarkesworld, Neil Clark. And in that one he was talking about conventions and what he gets from them, or what he expects to get from them. Anyway, we're mainly here to talk about fiction, so if we go on to another story, the next one I've got on my list is called Other Stories by Wang Yuan. What did you make of that one?
So, when I read stories, I try to inject myself into the story and to follow along with the main character, to experience what they experience, to feel what they feel. And because of that, there are some stories that really strike me the wrong way and, either scare or hurt me. And there are other ones that are warm and touching and moving. And Other Stories by Wang Yuan was that story for me, because it's a story about an engineer who is inventing time travel, and his relationship with his mom, who brought him up all by herself because he lost his father when he was young. That's a lot like my story in a lot of ways. And the mother's getting older, and you have that whole concern about how you care for your mother when she's becoming older and less able to care for herself. And I was touched and moved. It was a good story for me.
I also liked this one. I very much like the tone of it and the style of it, possibly more than the actual story, but the actual setting and the characters I thought were very well done. I think the mother is a science fiction writer in the story, isn't she?
She is.
So the mother's a science fiction writer. The child, who is an adult child, but her child is a scientist who experiments with time travel. Oh, and says that there is a law which prevents you from changing the past. And it's something to do with quantum entanglement. So this is one of those stories that does a bit of hand-waving around the scientific content, which is absolutely fine with me. But yeah, this kind of parallel telling of the story I thought was really nicely done. And I found it an easy read as well. Sometimes as a reader you get a bit bogged down in the style of the author, but this one I found it very easy to read. Nothing stood in my way of it, even though it was complex in the sense that it had these shifts of perspective telling the story from, I think, 3 different positions, really.
Yeah, there's the story, the position of the mother, the position of the son, and then the stories the mother is writing as this progresses.
Yeah, and it's probably my second favourite from the issue. The next one I've got on the list is Just One Step and Then the Next by E.N. Diaz. This one's about an old woman, or oldish woman, I think in an unidentified Central American country, unless I missed something. I don't think it specifically names the country, does it?
No, it invents the name of a city, and I should look to see if it was a real city or not. I suspect that it's not.
I did look up the name of the city, and I found nothing. I found some products that you can buy that have that name, but I couldn't find any real places that have that name. So in a sort of Central American state is what I imagine this to be, or maybe a Caribbean state. And it's where some kind of dictatorship has taken over, and you now need a permit to do everything. And the woman contacts her son, who lives nearby, but he apparently has disappeared. It's as if he's been abducted by the new powers that be, probably for some political misdeed or something. I kind of like this on a sentence by sentence level. And what I mean by that, it didn't disturb me or throw me out of the story as I was reading, and it had a good sense of this gradual clamping down and that the world is changing. I thought that was quite effective, and there was a good sense of this very humble woman by the end of the story somehow being central to a kind of resistance movement. I think that's how I sort of understood that. But then I put, at the end of my notes, but science fiction? Question mark?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it is. I'm not sure that it's fantasy. The only thing that makes it fantasy for me is that it's set in a fictional place.
Yeah, there were several things that struck me about this. You know, it was written 11 months after the attempted coup in the United States.
Right, I guess so, yeah.
And there were threats about, at one point, using the military, and the military flat out said, no, you may not use the military to alter the outcome of the election. Mm-hmm. It occurs to me that post-apocalyptic and dystopian fiction tends to fall into science fiction as a category. And because they had wrist communicators and the dystopia of the fallen state, I think that's probably why maybe it's why it was considered science fiction.
Yeah, you're right. They did have wristwatch, because she listens to something on her wristwatch. They don't call it a wristwatch. That's just me calling it that. But yeah, you're right. There is some device in the story, but it's not critical to the plot, I don't think. So yeah, I mean, I'm not against it just because it's not science fiction. I was just surprised that it was included in the magazine, because it didn't really seem to have the trappings, unless I missed something, which I might well have done. But it's interesting that you say that this might be a reflection or an echo of what had happened in the US. That just never occurred to me. Possibly because I don't live in the US, and possibly because we're now, or when this was published, we're 11 months on from there. It's one of those where I think I need to reread it, because I'm afraid I may have missed the point.
Yeah, I had that feeling with the first story.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's because, as I mentioned, when I read the stories, I intend to inject myself into them. Mm-hmm. And I found it hard to say, you know, these were natural consequences of the actions that the young girl took in the Cold Equations, versus should she have been used as a plot point or as a sacrifice to make the points of you should follow the rules and be a good person and etc.
The next story in my list it's called A Series of Endings by Amal Singh. This one, I've got a very tiny quote from the story. It's the story of a character whose life, and I quote, has many endings, unquote, but only one true beginning. And I wasn't really sure what to make of this one. The central character, well, he keeps coming to the end of his life, and he sort of keeps going back to the same beginning or some variation of the beginning. And again, I wasn't really sure what the point of this story was. The only kind of thematic thing that I could draw from it. And I may be barking totally up the wrong tree with this, but it seemed to be almost as if the central character was being endlessly reincarnated and given multiple opportunities, in contrast to these aliens that he meets, these Ganymedians, who say to him quite openly, "Oh, we only live one life, but we devote ourselves to trying to live forever." So I wondered if this was some kind of comment on the benefits of believing in reincarnation or not believing in reincarnation, and what the consequence would be of such a belief. I don't know if that's what the story was really about. I was a bit baffled by it.
Yeah, this story was unusual for me in that I couldn't finish it. After so many untranslated words and phrases and unexplained language, I didn't feel like I could follow along and know what was happening anymore. So I simply stopped.
It's funny you should say that. It reminded me of an experience from my school days. In my school days, we were given a book by Rudyard Kipling to read, which was Kim, which is probably not a bad book, actually, but it is full of untranslated Indian words. Now, what Kipling was trying to do, I gather, was to make it feel as if you were in India, where the story takes place. And, you know, if you're in a place which is foreign to you, you will be surrounded by this unfamiliar language. But I find that very off-putting in a story. I found it off-putting when it's a book by Nobel Prize winner Rudyard Kipling, and I found it off-putting in this story as well. Mm-hmm. But I realised that happens in science fiction stories as well. Science fiction authors, they'll make up words. So words not that are there because they are foreign words, but because they've invented some technology that doesn't really exist. So they're dropping words in that you've never seen before. But there's some kind of difference between a word which is dropped in passing and which you can guess the understanding of from the context, and a word which is italicized and clearly of foreign origin and kind of says to you, you don't know what this word means, and makes no effort to help you. I just personally have a kind of a block when I read stories of that nature. So yeah, I didn't get much from this story, I'm afraid. I did make it to the end, but I'm none the wiser for it.
Yeah, maybe it's one of those stories I need to come back and try and read in a different frame of mind, or just to try and push through it. We'll see.
I don't think I will. The next one on the list is Beneath the Earth, Where the Nymphs Sleep by Megan Feldman. And I'm afraid I didn't have time to read this one. I skimmed through it, and here are my notes in total. 1. Something to do with genes and an enclave? ? 2. Looks very science fictional. 3. Written in past tense. And that's the sum total of my comments. Oh. Do you have anything to say on this one?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a cyberpunk biopunk story with body modifications at the genetic level, if not more deep. And it has a kind of that big business is bad vibe going for it as well, where the main character is in the enclave, which has its own kind of ruling class, but they're beholden to a company for gene mods in order to make the supply of algae, which is their source of food and energy and plastics. And our main character, Rana, is an escapee from the big business, and she's now part of the Enclave, and the Enclave wants her to take on a role which will completely ostracize her from the rest of society, because it'll grant her a longevity, and so she won't be able to have relationships that are, well, she feels are meaningful, because she'll be able to watch she'll watch people grow old and die. And it's a question she asks other people that have had that role. It's like, well, how did you survive doing this, and why are you asking me to do it? And the story wanders a bit between that and an eventual search for her sister, who she thought that she lost.
It sounds like a lot of stuff for a short story.
It is. It's not a bad story. It's kind of reminiscent of Johnny Mnemonic in a way.
Okay, yeah. It did sound a bit like that as you were recounting it, yeah.
Yeah, you're dropped right in the middle of it, and you just kind of roll along with it.
Very good. I've not done it justice with just scribbling down 3 notes about it there. And then the longest story of the batch is You Are Born Exploding by Rich Larson.
So this is a story that is definitely science fiction, and it kind of, for me, it imitates or echoes what we're going through today in the pandemic. So in the story, there is a pandemic happening on the planet, and it was brought by aliens. And I think for the purpose of discussing this, I'm just going to lay it all out. When you are infected by this, it transforms you physically into something they call a shambler. And it's a horrific thing to go through because your family gets to watch you devolve into this thing, which eventually wants to try and jump into the ocean and head toward this one central point where the alien ship seems to have landed. And you get to watch this happen through the point of a mom who's trying to protect her and her son from being infected and fails. As I mentioned, I like to inject myself into a story and travel right along with the characters. And boy, if I had to go through the process of having to travel to where my kids were and was waiting and waiting and waiting to see if they were going to come out of the wards with COVID after having had it, it would be devastating. So it was a difficult story to read at that level. Yeah. The final decision by the mother was horrific to me. I did not understand it.
When you say you didn't understand it, I'm putting words in your mouth here, but you understood what she decided to do and the reasons that the story gave for her doing it, but you can't get into the mindset of somebody who would make that decision? Or is it that the decision itself was unclear?
Oh, the decision was clear. It's I don't understand the reasoning behind the actions that she takes.
Right, yeah. But it sounds like you engaged with the story for the most part.
Oh, yeah.
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 If you had to name one story as being the best or your favourite from the whole issue, which one would you go for?
It would definitely be Vegvisir by David Goodman, the Martian survival story.
Right, yeah. I'd go for The Cold Calculations by Amy Ogden. But I liked most of the other stories. They all had something going for them. And sometimes I enjoyed the style but not the story. Sometimes I enjoyed the story but not the style. Sometimes both. Sometimes, well, in one instance, neither. There was one story which I didn't get on with really. And overall conclusions on Clarkesworld and comparing it with the 70-year-old Galaxy magazine. Obviously they have a different editorial approach. In no way would I say that the agenda of Clarkesworld feels like the agenda of Galaxy, but they're kind of typical in a sense of being successful science fiction magazines of their respective eras. So can we draw any overall conclusions?
I keep on seeing differences between them, like the fact that the 1951 story was all written by mainly written by authors in the Western world who were all men.
Yeah, that's the thing that sticks out like a sore thumb, doesn't it? It was mostly a male-dominated era, and certainly that issue of Galaxy from 1951, I think it was all male authors in there. And I think most American. I think there was one British author, if I remember rightly, and all the rest were American.
Yeah, John Wyndham.
Yeah. Here in Clarkesworld, many more female and non-binary writers, and a much greater diversity of backgrounds for the writers. So I counted them up. In this particular issue of Clarkesworld, there were 2 Americans, 1 Scot, 1 person from China, 1 from India, 1 from Mexico, and 1 I've put from all over. And that's Rich Larson, because in his biography it says he was born in Niger, studied in the US, and lives in Canada. So I don't actually know what his nationality is. So that's a lot more diverse, and some of these stories were translated, or at least one of the stories was translated from another language, which I don't think Galaxy would have done back in the day. So this strikes me as being although it's an American magazine in terms of that's where its home is, it strikes me as being far more global than Galaxy would have been 70 years ago.
Yes. And look at the incredible breadth in science fiction that we have from these international multi-gendered casts of authors.
Yeah.
Whether I personally liked it or not, or identified with it, or was horrified or not with it, like I said, it's incredibly diverse. It's very rich, creative, interesting, engaging at all kinds of different levels.
Yeah. Sort of a good overall blend, I thought, because there are some stories that are hard science fiction. I mean, hard, don't misunderstand the term, folks. It doesn't mean difficult. It means science fiction that's concerned with the hard sciences. So there were some stories that were of that nature, but an awful lot of stuff that was character focused, and really you would have to call it speculative fiction rather than science fiction, some of it. And that, I don't mean that in any judgmental kind of way. It's simply a way of categorizing things.
I recently finished a book called The History of Science Fiction by Xavier Dolo.
Oh, great.
It's a graphic novel, which was an incredible approach to take to this. And it talked about how originally it wasn't even called science fiction, it was scientification. And it was the study of the science. And that science, that concept of speculation has then grown to what happens to humanity due to the development and the influence of these sciences, and has made incredible stories that I really like.
Yeah. And obviously, as we've said before, all of this material in Clarkesworld is free, whereas Galaxy you had to pay for back in the day. Of course, nowadays you can get all the old issues of Galaxy for free because people have scanned them and put them on the internet, but you were never supposed to get them in that way.
Well, and still not in most cases.
Well, that's absolutely right. Great to have everything for free and in so many different formats, so you can choose how to experience it. The audiobook versions, I listened to most of the stories in audiobook form, and generally they're very well read. It's all of these were read by the same person, and it's a very good reading. It's not 100% perfect in the editing of the audio or in the reading. There are occasional slip-ups, but it's you know, to actually read an entire magazine aloud and then make it available to people, it's quite an achievement. You know, you need dedicated people to do that work. So I thought it was very good. Some stories, of course, don't work very well in audio form, and the story called Other Stories used a kind of a typographical gimmick, really, to identify whose story we were hearing. So I think it used 1A to signify the mother's story and 1B to signify the son's story, or something like that. And that works on the page because you see it and you recognise it. Yeah. But when you're listening to the story read and you hear them say 1B, you think, what? What are you talking about? So that device just doesn't work. My only gripe at all with Clarkesworld, with this issue that we've read, is that in the Kindle version, the navigation is a little bit awkward. I can find my way to a story from the table of contents, but if I want to skip to another story, I find that almost impossible to do. I have to go back to the table of contents and then work through to it again. So I'd like them to improve the navigation if they possibly could on the Kindle. And my other gripe, a very, very small gripe, is that the order of the stories is different on my laptop when I'm looking at the web page to what it is in the Kindle. And they release the audio version of the stories as a podcast. And again, the order that those are listed is not the same as in my Kindle. So I realise this is very much a first world problem here. It's not a big deal, but it would be nice to have a consistent reading experience across the piece.
Yeah, I could see that, especially if you were trying to listen along to the audio while you're following along on the Kindle.
Yeah, but I wonder how many people actually do that. It's probably just me.
No, there's got to be other people. I'm totally unique. There is no one else in the world with my name.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
There are something like 600 Kuskies in the world, and only one of them is named Colin.
And that's you.
And I have come to realize that's probably about the only totally unique thing about me. And so, yeah, there have to be other people that listen along.
So that was Clarkesworld. I have to say I was quite impressed with it. It was a randomly chosen issue. I mean, we didn't pick it because it's supposed to be a particularly good one or anything like that. It was simply because it was published 70 years after the issue of Galaxy that we read. And for a randomly chosen issue, I think it has a couple of strong stories in there, and very little that lets it down, I thought. So I was quite impressed. So if Neil Clark is listening to this, I quite liked it. Thank you.
Yeah, and to the authors as well.
Absolutely, yeah. The authors are what make it.
Before we wrap the podcast, I wanted to ask you one other question.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to say the name Sleestack, does that ring any bells?
Sleestack. It rings bells. I'm trying to think where I know that word from. Is it from a TV series?
It is.
Is it an alien creature?
Well, yes.
Trying to think of the name of the show that I think it is. I can't remember. No, you have to tell me.
It's from Land of the Lost.
Ah, yeah, Land of the Lost is the one I was thinking of, but I couldn't think of the title of it.
And that's why I hesitated about, aliens, because I think they were actually from the center of the Earth. Coming across my Facebook page was notice of a Sleestack attack on January 28th on the east side of Portland in the Selwood neighborhood, where there are some folks that have some extremely authentic looking Sleestack costumes. And with the permission of the people in the neighborhood, we're going around trying to abduct people to go back to the Sleestack home. Which just goes to tell you, science fiction is everywhere with all kinds of things and all kinds of people.
That's shocking. Well, thank you, Colin, for browsing through Clarkesworld with me. The bottom line question really is, which do you prefer? Do you prefer the 1950s style Galaxy magazine or the 2020s style Clarkesworld?
Wow. I think I'm tempted to do a half dodge because I liked stories from both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I might have liked the 1951, more stories in the 1951 magazine than the 2021. But that's purely a personal feeling rather than, a value judgment.
Overall, I sort of enjoyed reading Galaxy a bit more, but I think it was because it really felt that we were delving into a different time. And it was things like the adverts, seeing the ads for books and stuff has an obvious sort of I was going to say a nostalgia value, but as I pointed out when we recorded that episode, it was from a time before either of us was born, so it's not real nostalgia. It's a nostalgia for a past we never experienced. There's something about the style of it that is very seductive. And Clarkesworld, what advertising it has, if any, is totally unobtrusive. So, I wasn't really aware of there being any. Maybe there wasn't any at all. I don't know. Well, I think we're done.
I would agree. Yeah.
Oh, good. So we'll say thanks for listening, everyone, and we hope you'll join us next time. We're Phil Mickles and Colin Kusky. Our theme tune is from purpleplanet.com. And look out for the show notes on our website, which is 101sf.blogspot.com. And also find us on Facebook as Science Fiction 101. And finally, please follow us or subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, or wherever you get your podcasts.